just authentication a key with this command, and also you can use the keychain, but it's necessary to configuring the IP OSPF authentication message digest. Look at here, show IP OSPF interface VLAN 1. Let me to configure IP OSPF authentication message digest. Now show IP OSPF in interface VLAN 1 can show us that we are using MD5 authentication with the keychain A that is ready and using the key ID of 1. In NXOS2 also we should enable the IP OSPF authentication message digest. Now show IP OSPF neighbor can show us that we have neighborship, and in the NXOS2 show IP OSPF interface VLAN 1 show us that we are using the message digest authentication using keychain A. Okay, because of that, the first command should be used for the type 2 and the second command can be different. It's better to using the keychain. Keychain is more flexible. These are the, for example, authentication types of the OSPF, interface-based authentication type of OSPF, and the best method is type 2, the hash-based method. We are using MD5 in the hash-based method, but if you want to use the more flexible method, it's better to using the keychain mode. Also, we have one other notation here. You know that, for example, if you have 10 interfaces, you should configure 10 times IP OSPF authentication message digest or IP OSPF authentication. Such as the iOS, you can configure the type of authentication globally in the OSPF. It's so easy. Look at here. In the OSPF, router OSPF, okay, for example, under the switch config router, you can configure only the type of authentication, not the key of authentication, with this command, area ID, okay, authentication. This means that for the area ID, I'm using the clear text authentication. Or you can use authentication message digest. This means that for the area ID, I'm using the MD5. Don't forget, for every interface, you should configure the authentication key. This command is useful only for configuration of the authentication type in one area. Let me to show you. Look at here. For example, in NXOS1, okay, we are in area 0. Let me first removing the configuration of the authentication on the interface. No IP OSPF message digest key, no IP OSPF authentication, okay, message digest, and also in the NXOS2, no IP OSPF authentication message digest, authentication, okay, message digest. Look at here, let me to show you. In switch 1, show run interface VLAN 1. As you can see, we enabled IP OSPF authentication with keychain A, but now this type of authentication doesn't work. Why? Because we didn't enable IP OSPF authentication message digest. Let me to show you. Show IP OSPF interface VLAN 1. Look at here. We don't have authentication. Also in NXOS2, let me check show IP OSPF interface VLAN 1. We don't have authentication. And now we have neighborship, show IP OSPF neighbor, without any type of authentication. After that, I'm going to use in the router OSPF 1, look at here, router OSPF A, this type, area 0, for example, authentication message digest. This means that for the area 0 interfaces, please use the authentication type of message digest. After that, you should configure the authentication key, for example, message digest key or keychain on the interface yourself. But with this command, it's not needed to configuring on all interfaces of, for example, a router, the IP OSPF authentication message digest, the type of authentication. Very good. Let's check the switch 1 again, show IP OSPF neighbor. After some seconds, we will lose the neighborship, show IP OSPF interface VLAN 1. Look at here. In the VLAN 1, in this interface now, I'm using the method of the message digest 5, show run interface VLAN 1, but here we don't mention, I didn't mention the type of authentication. Why? Because we mentioned it on the router OSPF. After some second we should lose the neighborship, show IP OSPF neighbor. Now we don't have neighborship. Let's go to the switch 2. In switch 2 you can configure the authentication type on the interface or on the OSPF. For example, it's better to show you we can configure authentication type in the interface, IP OSPF authentication message digest. It's okay. Do show IP OSPF neighbor. After some second we will have neighborship, because the type of authentication can be configured on the interface or on the router OSPF. It's okay. And also we have one important note, and that is if you configure area authentication and also you are configuring the, for example, authentication type on an interface, the preferred method is the authentication type on the interface. For example, assume that you configured area 0 authentication, means please use the clear text method for area 0, and also you configured IP OSPF authentication message digest on one of the interfaces of the area 0. The second method is preferred because the interfaces command is more preferred or is more specific than the global command. It's important to know. And finally, as a final note, if you configured an area with a type of authentication, for example, clear text, or the type of authentication maybe is the message digest MD5, and you don't need to enable authentication on one interface, you can use this command. For example, on the interface, IP OSPF authentication null. Okay, authentication null. For example, assume that I configured area 0 authentication and I don't need to configure authentication on one of the interfaces of the area 0. I can use this command on that interface, IP OSPF authentication null. Because this command is configured on the interface, is preferred to the global command, IP OSPF authentication null. Finally, we have 3 types of authentication in the OSPF in NXOS. The first is type 0, means no authentication or null authentication. By default, this type is enabled. If you want to disable this mode, you should enable another type of authentication. The second type is type 1, clear text. This is not a good method. This is not a secure method because the passwords, the keys can be read on the packets of the OSPF. You can enable this command with the IP OSPF authentication and IP OSPF authentication key on the interface. And the third method is type 2, hash-based method. And the hash is created from the MD5 message digest 5. You can use this method with 2 series of commands. The first command is IP OSPF authentication message digest. This is the command for enabling the authentication of message digest, and after that you should use IP OSPF message digest key ID MD5 key. This is the first method. The second is IP OSPF authentication keychain chain name. The second is preferred. And finally, if you want, you can configure all of the interfaces that reside on one area with one command instead of using many commands for authentication type. With this command, area ID authentication or area ID authentication message digest. The first type is for clear text and the second for the message digest 5. Look at here. In the, for example, switch 1, I configured area ID with the OSPF, with the message digest authentication, show run OSPF. Okay. Now show IP OSPF can show us that for the area 0 backbone area, we configure the message digest authentication because I configured this command globally on the router OSPF. And after all of these features, the best practice is to configuring the OSPF interface, the OSPF authentication, and the best method is using the type 2 hash base with the, for example, keychain or with the message digest key 1 by 1.